This is our second episode in Evolve 2021 webinar series called The Future of U.S.-China Relations. My name is Sabrina Stark. I am the University Partnership Manager here at Absolute Internship. We are based in Barcelona, Spain, so thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited to have all of you here and as well our speakers. So just to give you a quick overview of who we are, Absolute Internship, before we get into the session. Absolute Internship was founded in 2009. We have supported over 5,000 student interns since then. On average, we have students from 53 different nationalities in our programs and work with over 800 companies worldwide in 30 different industries. And here you have an overview of where our programs are. Today, we're especially interested in our programs that take place in Beijing and Shanghai, China. So we have two programs that we run there every year. And just to give you a little bit of an overview of why this session is so special and important for us at Absolute Internship is that we were actually born out of an internship in China. So one of our co-founders was interning for the Beijing Olympics back in 2007, 2008. And our other co-founder was actually studying in China at the time, and they met there. And the idea of creating Absolute Internship was really born from a love of being in China and having this amazing experience of the Olympics and working with the Chinese people. And it was truly just magical and inspired them to start our company. One of our really important partners in Absolute Internship is definitely our host companies. We work with over 350 different companies in China, in Beijing and Shanghai, and about a third of them are international companies. And we have welcomed, since starting in 2009, around 2,500 students in China from all over the world. About 2/3 of them come from U.S. universities. So this is a very special topic for us. And we just wanted to say thank you to the Freeman Asia Foundation that has financially supported over 500 of our students in their internship programs. And without this funding, for many students, it would not be possible to do an on-site internship in China. So we are very thankful for the foundation and all the work that they do in encouraging travel of U.S. citizens to China. And on another part, we also welcome Chinese students in our program. So we've welcomed around 500 in Europe and in Asia programs. And that's also very special for us as well. Our Chinese students are also very important to us and the diversity of our program. And we're very thankful to have them be a part of who we are as well. So we just wanted to mention that too. So without further ado, we'd like to go ahead and get started with our session on the future of U.S.-China relations. And I would like to introduce our three speakers that we have here today. We have Mr. Kerr Gibbs, who is the president at the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai. Kerr Gibbs first came to China in 1985 and has worked in various roles, giving him broad exposure to U.S.-China relations and business issues facing American companies operating in Asia. In the 1990s, Mr. Gibbs worked for the Boston Consulting Group in Shanghai, and since then he has split his time between Asia and the Silicon Valley, serving in executive positions with Apple, Disney, and high-growth internet businesses. He moved to Shanghai in 2002 as head of Asia Pacific for a NASDAQ-listed network security company that was acquired by McAfee. His career in high tech led him to banking. He became head of technology and media in Greater China for HSBC. As an investment banker, he worked with Alibaba, Baidu, and other firms advising on mergers and cross-border transactions. From banking, Mr. Gibbs moved to direct investments. He was a founding investor in the Crystal Orange Hotel Group helping grow the company to 130 properties and 1,500 employees in China. He also led successful investments in real estate, e-commerce, and medical technology companies. And before his appointment as president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Gibbs was elected 3 times to the Board of Governors of the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai and served as a chairman for 2016 and 2017. And he also sits on the board of the United Way in China and volunteers with Renewal, a local homeless shelter, and is an op-ed contributor to the Wall Street Journal, South China Morning Post, and other publications. He holds a BA in economics from UCLA and an MBA from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. So thank you so much for Mr. Gibbs taking time out of your very busy schedule to be here with us today. I'd also like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Tingru Damien Wang. He is a partner and the head of the trademark department at Mingdun law firm in Beijing, China. He works with both startups and multinational companies, advising them on contentious and non-contentious matters. And he often argues before various Chinese courts, including the Supreme Court of China. He is qualified for the California Bar, the China Bar, and the China Patent Bar. As a lawyer, he has a law degree in European intellectual property law from Uppsala University of Sweden. He also has a Master's of Law from University of International Business and Economics of China. And he studied as well at Beijing Institute of Graphic Communication. And he has represented US companies in China, such as Best Buy, AutoZone, Macmillan Publishers, Giorgio Armani, Carnegie, and Charles Schwab in different lawsuits that they've had. So he has a lot of great experience that we will look forward to hearing from today. And thank you so much for joining us. And last but not least, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Zachary Scarlett. He is Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History at Butler University in the United States and has been a faculty advisor for programs in China with their students. He works on Maoist politics and culture, and he has been focusing on the Chinese Communist Party's understanding of radical political movements in the 1960s. And he's particularly interested in the Communist Party, how they have incorporated events like the Civil Rights Movement, anti-Vietnam War protests, and other activism in everyday political discourse. He has conducted research for his project in Beijing back in 2010 to 2011, which was supported by a Fulbright grant. He is the co-editor of The Third World in the Global 1960s, and he also teaches classes at Butler University on modern China, East Asia, the Cold War, and environmental history. And he received his PhD from Northeastern University. So thank you so much, Dr. Scarlett, for being with us here today. And I don't know if you guys just like to say something before we get started into the talk.
As you mentioned in the introduction, I came out as a fresh college graduate to China, and literally because I really didn't have anything else to do when I graduated from UCLA. And my mother is from China. That was the one part that we didn't cover in the bio, is that my mother is actually from China, and she wanted me to. I'm a Eurasian, half American, half Chinese, and my mother wanted me to see China, and so she gave me literally a one-way ticket to come to China and experience what was going on here. And that was in 1985, which is a very, very different situation than what we have today. But I've had most of my career has been either here in China or kind of going back between China and the United States. And I've learned a lot. I still feel like I'm still learning, about what's going on in China. And I'm just delighted to be here and happy to contribute to this program any way I can.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gibson, and for being available so late at night.
Sure.
Thank you. Mr. Wang, would you like to just say a couple words before we get started?
Yeah, thank you for the very warm introduction for me. I guess I represent the host company. I have hosted 4 students come to China. One is in-person internship the other three is a remote internship, and the one who spent several months with me in the office is from Butler University of hi, Mr. Dark, from from your college. So this is a wonderful experience for us. Happy and honored to be with you guys today, and I'm more than willing to share some of my points. Hope they will be helpful.
Thank you. And Dr. Scarlett.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening. It's great to say that on a talk because it means we're truly international here. For me, from my perspective as a professor, international studies and going to China is the most critical goal that I have with my students. Part of that is because it takes the abstraction of the classroom and actually allows students to experience what we've talked about in class up close and personal. But part of that is also deeply personal for me. Unlike Kerr, I never really thought about China growing up, very frankly. It just wasn't part of the American education system. And it wasn't until I took a class very randomly in college that I started to think about China, but that class was like a lightning strike for me. And from there, I became deeply interested in the subject. But again, it was only when I started to go to China for the first time in 2006. And in 2006 and 2007, I studied at Beijing University, Chinese language specifically, and then have sort of been going back for research and for my Fulbright grant and then taking students. And for me, that's sort of a really meaningful cycle in which I kind of got to experience the country through these study abroad programs. And now I consider it the most important part of my job to introduce students to China and to Chinese society.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm going to let you take the floor, Dr. Scarlett, about the current and future state of U.S.-China relations.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you again. So I think what I'd like to do today and what Sabrina's kind of asked me to do is to give a more general overview of U.S.-China relations and then specifically tie them and root them into study abroad. In doing so, I think I want to make three kind of larger points. The first, I think, if I may speak for my fellow panelists, that we're all very enthusiastic about American students studying in China and believe in the utility of that process. But I also think that we can't sugarcoat things right now by saying that, and here I'll speak just for myself, that US-China relations currently, I think, are at the lowest point they've been at in quite some time. Maybe lower than even in 1989 or 1999. And I think that, as people who are encouraging students to study abroad, we have to acknowledge that reality and some of the causes of why US-China relations are at this nadir. I also think that at the center of the sort of low point that US-China relations have reached, we also have to acknowledge that universities are at the forefront of this, and that both, I think, at the forefront of some of the tensions that are going on right now, but also as part of the possible solution. Even though I think that US-China relations are at a low, I'll also say that those relations have tended to move in sort of an undulating wave. And so I do think, and the third point I want to make, is that there is hope for the future. Both in that if the pattern repeats itself, this relationship will recover as it has before, but also in that exchange and contact is one of the most critical diplomatic tools that we have. We tend to think about diplomacy being conducted among high-ranking officials, obviously in Washington and Beijing, but student to student and person to person contact, I would argue, in mass is just as critical. So I think one thing, again, that we have to just be upfront about is American perceptions of China as they currently exist. Last week, 2 new polls were released in the United States, which showed that 9 out of 10 Americans currently view China as a competitor, and nearly half of them believe the US should seek to limit China's power. That's according to a Pew Research poll. And a Gallup poll also released last week put China's unfavorable view among Americans at 79%, which is the worst that number has gotten since 1979, and only Iran and North Korea scored worse. I think there's a general consensus in the American press that bipartisanship is impossible to reach in Washington, but I think that hardline Chinese policy is one of the few bipartisan issues that currently exist in the United States. It's just a matter of how hardline and how those policies are articulated. I also think we have to acknowledge in the United States a wave of anti-Asian racism and even physical attacks that have sort of spread around the country. Again, not to sort of be overly negative about the prospect of Americans going to China, but to acknowledge that, and something that I found very personally is that there's a lot of negative sentiments that currently exist in American society. And that means that convincing students to go to China has become increasingly difficult. I think that this is something that has changed even the last 15 years. You know, in the pre-2008 Olympics, I think there was a groundswell of students who were very interested and very enthusiastic to go to China, but that has since dissipated. And I think adopting different strategies and also acknowledging some of the difficulties, but trying to work around them in American universities is critical for facilitating exchanges between the United States and China, especially among young students. I will say also on a more positive note that even though those numbers that I read sort of about some more negative feelings that currently exist in American society, in my personal view, those that students are less negative, that students are still intensely curious and interested and want to engage with China. So I think even though those numbers are sort of profoundly on the side of viewing China a little more as a competitor, that American students, I think, positively still realize the importance and the utility of studying in China. So if we also think about the view from China, again, I can speak very personally. I don't think that such numbers exist about Chinese perceptions of the United States. But on a very personal level, I can also attest that I still, despite some of the challenges that currently exist in US-China relations, feel that personally, I'm still greeted very warmly in China, that there's still a lot of room for cooperation, that the general attitude and consensus among Chinese people remains very open and friendly, and that studying and that being an American in China, while increasingly challenging, is not something that forecloses a very positive experience. And I guess this is sort of cutting to the third point here, but I still think that exchange is very possible and important. Nonetheless, the various challenges that exist, I think, have animated sort of this breakdown in US-China relations. Again, if we think about the early 2000s, the consensus, I think, around the world was that this idea of superfusion, that the Chinese and American economy had become so closely fused together that neither could exist without the other. And that, I think, animated a lot of exchange and a lot of business opportunities. I think in the last 5 years, the United States, at least, particularly has transitioned to a policy of decoupling, which essentially means trying to remove the American economy's reliance or connections with the Chinese economy. This has manifested itself in restrictions on Chinese technology, on tariffs, on more aggressive sort of diplomacy, including calling out calling out Chinese human rights abuses. The Trump administration and the Biden administration has also expressed more ardent support for Taiwan and been more critical of militarization in the South China Sea. So just policy has shifted in that way, but that's also been accelerated, of course, by the global pandemic, which is, I think, one of the central issues that is going to dictate foreign study in China, not just in 2021, but I would expect for the next 5 years at least. I think that foreign exchange might become more accessible in the next year or two, but that the effects of the global pandemic is going to continue to resonate and cascade and inform this relationship. I'm sure I don't need to tell you the ways in which the Trump administration enacted a number of policies that, frankly, I think really are the cause of the breakdown of the US-China relationship. If we think about the Biden administration and ask, is there hope for a change in policy? I think that the answer to that is still unclear. Will things change under President Biden? I think that the Biden administration has committed itself to a clearer and China policy with a clearer set of policies and objectives, but that doesn't necessarily mean shifting away from the more hardline policy. I think the Biden administration has also signaled, again, according to the New York Times, that China policy will not revert anytime soon to what it was a decade ago, when I think it was much more positive and when exchange was more possible. The Biden administration has not signaled any let-up in Trump's tariffs, on the restrictions to Chinese diplomats, journalists, and academics, nor has the Biden administration seemed to be willing to let up on criticism of Chinese policies towards Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Xinjiang. And China policy has also become very politicized. And here is maybe some room for hope. I think the Biden administration feels very constrained politically. Even if they want to adopt a more conciliatory China policy, they can't do it for political reasons right now, because any let up in hardline China policy is going to incur immediate rebuke from particularly Republicans who have used the recent hearings for Biden's cabinet members to probe about their individual feelings towards China, about whether they would be willing to let up on restrictions on Huawei, for example, about their past speeches or any show of support. So it seems clear that this is still being used as a political issue in Washington, and that is driving the Biden administration's policies towards China. I will also say that in his first phone call with Xi Jinping, the sort of leader of China right now, President Biden pressed Xi on issues of Hong Kong human rights abuses against the Uyghur ethnic minority in Xinjiang, and its actions towards Taiwan. So even in centering those issues, the Biden administration has signaled that it's not going to let up on calling China out on what it views as human rights abuses. I think the Chinese perspective is generally more positive. After that first phone call, Xi Jinping acknowledged that there was differences, but also called for these differences to be managed equally. And I think he sounded a generally positive tone. But some diplomats and the Chinese foreign minister have also asked that President Biden relinquish or let up on some of the, quote, dangerous practices that the Trump administration enacted. So as I see, I've talked for almost 10 minutes now. Let me get to my final point here. Is there room for hope? I think there is room for hope for improved relations between China and the United States over the next 5 years. And I think there's two particular ways that this sort of improved relations could manifest themselves. First is on the coronavirus and the clearing up of the pandemic, in which I think that global exchange will become easier overall, and I'm hopeful that it will become easier with China. The second is the Biden administration's commitment to addressing issues of climate change. And here particularly, I think there's real opportunity for improved US-China relations. I think the Biden administration's acknowledgement of climate change and their willingness to work on this issue also then allows for or naturally leads to greater cooperation with China, because the climate change issue is not going to be solved without pretty close Chinese-American cooperation. And I think that also could be a potential avenue for exchange and for internships that students might pursue in the future. I think others are hopeful because the Biden administration seems to have a less hardline policy on issues of immigration and acquiring visas. And if the United States is less hardline on that, I think China will be less hardline on its visas. Some people have expressed hope that Dr. Jill Biden, as an educator, will be more of an advocate for study abroad programs, and I'm also hopeful in that regard. And lastly, I think a real sign to watch for in the possibility of American students going to China is whether the United States is more willing to welcome Chinese students coming to America. And this too has been a particular issue that has held up foreign exchange. I don't think it's as much China as the United States, which has really restricted visas of American students, American scientists, Chinese students, Chinese scientists, Chinese educators coming to the United States. And that has provoked a counter reaction from China. And so I think if the United States is more willing to open up those visas and return to the sort of pre-Trump status quo of allowing more Chinese students and educators and scientists to come to the United States, then China will reciprocate in kind. The last thing I'll say, which is important to me personally, is in 2019, the United States ended the Fulbright program in China. I think a key way that U.S.-China relations can be improved and that also exchange can be better facilitated is restoring of that program. And that's something directly related to American universities. But restoring the Fulbright program and sort of returning funding that allows American students to go to China under this Fulbright program, and also bringing Chinese students to the United States under the Fulbright program, will be critical for not just U.S.-China relations, but for the exchange of students going between the United States and China. So I'll end there sort of with that general overview, and then look forward to returning to some more personal sort of conversation about what my experiences and what I see as sort of utility of study abroad in China.
Thank you, Dr. Scarlett. That's amazing. And we will have time for question and answers at the end of the session for our audience to also ask you questions as well about anything that you mentioned. So thank you. Moving on to Mr. Wang, we wanted to speak specifically about the legal atmosphere in China, your experience as a partner of a law firm in Beijing, and your expertise in intellectual property in the legal field, especially over the past 10 years in China. So I will give you the floor.
Thank you, Sabrina. There are big and small changes, but I would like to mention 2 points that might be helpful. The first one is compared to Western nations, especially EU and America, the level of intellectual property protection in China is still low, very low. The legislations are very good in my perspective. The problem is there is insufficient enforcement of the law. And for this point, I think you probably will read more news than me, because I trust that the media in the Western nations will report a lot about how China does not respect IP, does not protect IP. That's partially true, I would say. And for the reasons, there could be many, but I think the biggest reason is still this simple philosophy, that is the economic foundation is decisive of the superstructure, and the legislation, law, intellectual property, all kind of stuff are just the superstructure. If we look back the history, Germany and America, they developed their economy by copying the intellectual property of the United Kingdom, and Japan then copied the United States. So in order for China to continue to develop, this is the way. This is not something I'm proud of or the nation is proud of, but there is no other way. This is the first point. And the second point is in the past 10 years, the intellectual property protection level in China has witnessed a great development. For example, we have established a intellectual property court in Beijing, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. And we also established the internet court in Beijing, Guangzhou, and Hangzhou. And we are combating bad faith trademark squatters or pirates. And for these changes, there are reasons also. Some reason is from outside pressure, especially from America. We do receive a lot of pressure from that. I, as a practicing lawyer, I can feel the pressure passed to me by the client and by the court, of course. And also there is inner pressure and demand, because it used to be made in China, and now more and more things are created by China. So we, for example, we have this high-speed train. We do not steal, we do not rob, we trade the Chinese market with Germany for the fundamental technology. Then we develop the technology into the next level. And now China is competing with Germany and Japan globally for high-speed train, purchase orders. And we have to protect the IP of high-speed train, of course, and something like that. Anyway, and another example is about internet. So I would say internet law in China now is very good because we are strong in that field. Globally, we can see China and America are the top two in terms of internet economy. EU is kind of weak. So you will see the EU authorities are doing desperately whatever they can to kind of suppress the internet industry. Basically, is suppress the US companies, Facebook, Google. They often receive big fines from the EU authorities, right? So that's basically what I'm talking about. The economy is decisive of everything. And I see a very good phenomenon that is the America started to smash down Chinese companies. For example, the Huawei just mentioned by Professor Zach. So Huawei is a very unique presence in the Chinese market. They are probably is the best company that comply with the law the best. I do not believe they do anything bad. They do not steal technology because they have so many technology created by themselves. They are so good at 5G. So you will see all these things is not about law, it's about compete of economy, about technology. I mentioned the Huawei example is not to find the excuse for us to less protect intellectual property or to use less protective laws in other areas. I think we still have a long way to go. So of course I have to make, as a Chinese, self-criticism. I really do not know whether the Chinese are just smart or because there are so many loopholes in the enforcement of law that people just make use of it. I will give some examples, specific examples about trademark because I practice trademark law. The first example is China probably is the only nation in this world that has a supermarket for trademarks. Every year, there are over 7 million new trademark applications made in China. For Europe, is less than 200,000. America almost the same as EU. And all these, 7 million new applications of the trademarks in China, many of them are not for actual use. They put the mark on the supermarket. Most of them are online for sale, for profits, of course. And because trademark resources are very limited, you sometimes have to buy the trademark. Otherwise, your new application will be blocked because they are there. And another example is in the past, there are many Chinese individuals and companies, they will squatter, they will pirate the brands of foreign nations. Then they will hold the trademark as hostage to blackmail you for money. You pay money to get your brand back. But nowadays, they start to evolve. They do not sell the mark to you once they register. They actually open a factory to manufacture the products of your brand, resemble your product shape, size, color, everything. Then sell the products in the Chinese market and export it to the less developed nations. So, although I can understand, like I mentioned before, for the philosophy of economy's sake, we can be less protective. But the two examples I just given, I really do not understand why the government allows them to exist, because they really do not make good to the GDP, and they receive a lot of criticism from America, from EU. But criticism is a criticism, and the Chinese market is just so big and expanding all the time. And during the COVID-19 period, which is not ended yet, Chinese market is kind of a savior for these multinational companies. I can share a few numbers, not exactly accurate. In 2020, China attracted foreign investment. The increase is 4% foreign investment into China. And for the first time, China overtake America as the biggest foreign investment inbound nation. And on comparison, America witnessed almost 50% down. And Pizza Hut closed 300 stores in America and is offering to sell the rest 900 stores. And in China, Pizza Hut is opening new store all the time. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Starbucks, they witnessed sales growth in China in 2020, and I believe it is decreased in the rest of places of this world. So this pandemic caused me as a Chinese to to rethink about my views about China, because we did so good in cope with the pandemic. I'm not flattering about the Chinese government, but because as a civilian, I do not care about the pandemic at all, because I feel so safe. In case there is anything wrong in any place about the virus, the government will rush to the spot to get it solved very quickly. And you just imagine you have such a strong powered government that can manage resources so quickly, so efficiently. They are super strong also in develop the economy, and of course they are super strong in change the legal field if they want to. It's just not the right timing to change it to what the Western nations exactly want the legal field to be. Anyway, for foreign governments and for foreign companies, especially these big companies, they have to deal with the Chinese market. They have to deal with the Chinese government. Otherwise, they will lose more. So I have some small tips for them. Not for the US government or any government, just for the companies who are willing to do business in China. Number one, continue to bring forward criticism. Give more pressure to the Chinese. We need that. Yes, we need that. Number two, do not lose face. Who stays in the Chinese market longer, who will be hugely rewarded back at the end of the day. That's for true. Number three, please always try to remember that China is a socialism country. It's fundamentally different from Western nations. So try to change China is a wish, but be practical to understand about China, understand about China's law. If we are speaking of the law, retain the best lawyers to help you to solve the problem. About the best lawyers, if you are a 500 company, use the most expensive lawyers, retain the biggest law firm. And if you are not, spend some time to find the one that can take care of you. Number four, do not trust the media. Come to China, do welcome. Come to China to feel it for yourself, and you will be kind of surprised. For example, in 2020, I do not use paper money, paper banknotes for even one time. I made all the payments by my mobile phone. So this is what I want to share about China. And thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wang, so much for your information, and we look forward to questions at the end of the session. And then, Mr. Gibbs, if you don't mind speaking about business in China, specifically for U.S. businesses, citizens, and your thoughts on this, please.
Sure, I'd be delighted. And again, thanks for the opportunity. And one of the things I like about going third in a group like this is I get to listen to the other speakers and kind of react to things that they say, and it's always very interesting. And so I just make a couple of comments about what Mr. Wang has just said, which I think is really important, and that is, don't try to change China, and that's very true. Many people have tried, and if you go back sort of 2,000 years, 5,000 years, there's a lot of shifts have happened in this part of the world, and a lot of people have tried to change China, and what always happens is China ends up changing them. And so it is an exercise in futility. I've given a lot of talks about China, and everybody, people ask about, say, oh, what's China going to be like in the next 5 years, and I've always enjoyed sort of flipping that around and to say, no, the real question is not what China is going to be like in the next 5 years. The question really is, what's the rest of the world going to be like in the next 5 years with China in it? And I think that is actually the point right now. When you look at the conflict between China and frankly the rest of the world is what is the impact of the China's political and economic system on the rest of the world? And I think that is where a lot of this conflict is coming from. And I also enjoyed Professor Scarlett's comments as well, and I want to react just to some of that, but I'll get to that in a minute. I think what I'll do is talk very briefly about AmCham, talk a little bit about U.S.-China, talk about the economy, and then make comments about sort of business opportunities, and just kind of go through this as quickly as I can, so we can get to questions. AmCham, it's a business organization. We have about 3,000 members here in Shanghai. There's actually 4 American chambers in China. China's so large that we have actually 4 chambers. Of the 4, the one in Shanghai is by far the largest, this being the commercial center. And things that we do that are sort of important for listeners to understand kind of how we operate. We serve a function, we serve our members. Our goal is to promote U.S.-China commercial relations. We maintain a very active dialogue with both country governments. So I visit Washington, D.C. in normal times. I visit Washington, D.C. Twice a year to visit the White House, Congress, think tanks, U.S. Trade Representative, Treasury, people like that. And there I'll actually comment about one of the things that Professor Scarlett was talking about is sort of the disconnect and also the animosity that people have right now towards China. And I guess a quick observation about that and in reaction to some things that have been said is in my trips to Washington, D.C. over many years, I've actually seen the knowledge rate go way up. So people in Washington, D.C. today are much, much more knowledgeable about what's happening in China than they ever were before. And vice versa, here in China, people have a remarkably good understanding of, especially the American political system. And you saw that in action through this last year as we went through this agonizing electoral cycle. The Chinese side actually remained remarkably calm and didn't overreact, despite looking at some of the headlines and some of the horrible things that were said in public fora about China and whatnot. And China actually remained fairly calm through that whole process, and it's because they do understand the political system. Having said that, the disconnect right now between the two countries is enormous, as Professor Scarlett pointed out, and that's a problem. And I'll point to just a couple of things. I mean, one is there's a very common perception here in China that that the problem here is fundamentally that China's too successful. And the GDP, they talk a lot about this enormous GDP, which it is. They're going to grow probably 8% this year. They grew 2% last year. They've for many years they were growing double digits. They make a lot out of that at some point in the future. Some people think it's already happened, that China will surpass the United States in GDP. And there's a common perception in China that that's the problem, that the Americans are worried about China's strength and the large size of the GDP. They couldn't be more wrong. When I talked in the Pew Research that Professor Scarlett pointed to, if you dig down into those numbers, yes, there's a negative feeling towards China. It has nothing to do with GDP. And please, a lot of people on this call, and if you disagree, please tell me. But when I talk to people in the U.S., what's the problem with China? It's their aggressive position towards Taiwan. It's the South China Sea. It's all the things that Professor Scarlett mentioned. I never hear the fact that China's going to surpass the United States in GDP. I've never heard anybody in the United States say that that's an issue. So there's a huge disconnect there. there's another problem, and talking about U.S.-China relations right now. In my conversations with people on both sides, there's a perception in Washington D.C. that that the U.S. has sort of gone as far as we can to appease China and to accommodate China in the world global trading system, and now it's up to China to change. So China's going to have to change. They're going to have to change the way the state-owned enterprises are operating, change the way subsidies work, change IP, change their approach to IP law. That's the very common perception in the U.S. And again, Professor Scarlett mentioned that the unified position that between the Democrats and Republicans around China. If you look at what China's perception is right now about which court is the ball in, it is not in China. I mean, it is not up to China to change. Right now, China has no motivation whatsoever to come to the table and give a whole bunch of concessions and some kind of new trade agreement to the United States. Not going to happen. That's not where they are. China right now is going from strength to strength, especially coming out of COVID. And so that's really not going to happen. A couple of others. So there's big disconnects here in terms of just where the two countries are and kind of the common understanding. I'll say more, I guess more bad news. May as well get all the bad news out onto the table. And looking at how President Trump approached the problem versus how President Biden is approaching the problem. Again, Trump. He had a fairly narrow view of what he wanted to approach, what he wanted to attack within sort of this China issue. It was just about trade and investment. He really didn't care about some of these other issues. And again, as Professor Scarlett mentioned, the Biden administration has explicitly widened the aperture, if you will. They've put a broad set of issues on the table, and frankly, all those issues, any one of those issues is going to be far more difficult to solve than the trade issues. I mean, the trade, if you look at phase one of the trade deal, and there were some moves around IP that probably would have happened anyway. There was some market opening around financial services, and that was the trend to begin with. And so those weren't terribly difficult issues to resolve. Massive order of soybeans and corn and things like that. But what's more difficult to solve, right? Arm wrestling over the price of soybeans, or resolving the difference of opinion around human rights and democracy, right? I mean, there's no contest. I mean, it's going to be tough. Having said that, I would say that we are fairly optimistic about the team that President Biden's put together so far. Catherine Tai is a true professional. Tony Blinken. These are people with deep experience in this field. Janet Yellen, it's not clear yet, kind of what role she's going to play on sort of the China team, if you will. It'll probably be led more by Kurt Campbell, who's somebody that we know well and has deep experience in the region. And so the team we're very optimistic about. But yeah, it's too early to say, in terms of where this is going to go and what the issues are going to be. Couple things though, let's say to shift, and we can talk a long time about U.S.-China relations. And again, we have a very active dialogue on both sides, both governments. The economy and just sort of looking at overall opportunities, again, as Mr. Wang had mentioned, I mean, most of the American businesses over here, the China market is a must-have. Again, some of the rhetoric around the last 4 years about, the American companies should just, close up shop and, should stop investing in China and come back to the United States. Not going to happen. We do, one of the things that we do is the American Chamber. We collect quite a lot of data. We send out multiple surveys every year, and we ask companies kind of what their view is towards the China market and what their plans are for investment. And 10 out of 10 say, they're in the China market to stay. Very, very few of them are really looking to abandon this market. They tend to list, when we ask them that from the headquarters level, where does China rank in terms of priorities? It's either the number one, number two market globally in terms of the markets that they're investing in and where they're looking for growth. So again, all the large companies are looking at the China market as definitely a must-have. In terms of the economy, it's going extremely well. I mean, they came out of COVID very, very well. I think once, and I'm going to be careful how I say this, right? Because I think in the early stages of the COVID pandemic, both countries performed poorly, and both countries have questions that need to be answered. On the China side, it's sort of the November, December, early January timeframe. What was happening? What was being disclosed? I think there's a lot more that we need to know. In the United States, the same. January, February. Once the dust settles and we get this, taking a look back, there's questions that need to be asked. Having said that, once the extent of the pandemic was understood here in China, the government reacted extremely well and with great competence and with great cooperation. They solved a lot of these problems, both shutting down the economy here in Shanghai. I would call the shutdown fairly severe. It was quite dramatic, but it was short. It was about 6 weeks long, where everything was shut down, and then businesses came back very quickly and efficiently. And there was a great deal, very close cooperation. American Chamber of Commerce, we were working directly with a lot of the local authorities, the Public Health Bureau and others to get our companies reopened. So that has paid dividends. Looking at the economy in 2020, GDP growth was about 2.2%, which is remarkable. Now that's on the back of an expected growth rate pre-COVID would have been about 6%. So it was certainly down. And our companies certainly suffered that. Looking at some of the sectors that are still being hard hit, obviously travel and leisure is still down, but most of our companies are very much recovered. In 2020 was not that bad. So the 2.2% GDP growth is something that has been shared quite widely, again, outside of some of the obvious areas that are still suffering. 2021 is going to be outstanding. The sort of consensus estimates around GDP growth are between about 7.5% and 9%. The government has after the sort of two sessions conferences that just concluded today, I think, they came out with a 6% GDP growth number, which we think is very, very conservative. So we think it's probably going to be closer to about 8%. Lastly, I guess I'll just point out, a couple of sectors that we think are doing very well, and I will comment on sort of just the idea of, again, I think one of the speakers mentioned, don't believe everything you read, and again, the headlines, right? The headlines about China and business over here are all negative. The reality over here is that despite the trauma, I guess, of the last 4 years would be the word. The reservoir of goodwill towards American companies and American brands is actually quite strong. There's not a feeling of, despite the trade war and again all the rhetoric that we heard through the election cycle, there's not actually a backlash towards American brands. The Chinese consumers still like American products. They like working for American companies, and so we have a bright future here if assuming we can resolve the issues that we have. I do think that there's going to be a certain degree of decoupling, just because the relationship right now does seem to be defined around national security terms. And so some level of separation between the economies is probably inevitable. And that I'm talking about, again, sort of, the semiconductors, dual use technologies, things like that. The United States is going to be taking a different approach towards cooperation with China. That leaves basically everything else. So consumer products are quite strong over here. Retail sector, very strong. Healthcare, so all of these automotive All of these are actually very, very strong sectors that American companies are going to continue to do well. So what we see 2021 going forward is American companies are, again, here to stay. They're continuing to invest, and we have actually a fairly bright outlook on the future. But again, there's issues on the table that both governments are going to need to resolve. So I'll leave it there and look forward to questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gibbs. And before we go to the questions and comments from the audience, we just wanted to speak with all three of you about your thoughts on international internships for university students. So Professor Scarlett, you've been a faculty leader with university students in China. Mr. Wang, you have also been a supervisor to several of our students who are interning in China. And then Mr. Gibbs, kind of your perspective as well of, like you're mentioning, the different businesses, sectors, industries that will have a lot of opportunities for students wanting to gain professional experience. So we'd really like to hear just your guys' thoughts on this about doing international internships in China.
I'm a huge fan of interns, huge fan of internships. I've got, on normal years, the American Chamber, we have probably 10 or 12 interns. So the American Chamber, we have a staff of about 50 people, most of whom are in Shanghai, and then we cover the whole Yangtze River Delta, meaning Suzhou, Nanjing, and also Hangzhou. We have an office there. And so we've got about 50 staff. We, under normal circumstances, we take 10 or 12 interns, both from local schools as well as international schools. And we get a lot out of it. Right now, I've got 3 or 4 interns in my office. We also have a program where we sort of cycle people through the American Chamber. So in other words, they start at DamCham and go through kind of a training program or boot camp, I guess you could call it, where they settle in with us and kind of get comfortable. Attend some lectures. We have people come in from the membership and just talk about sort of career development, presentation skills, those kinds of things. And then we push them out into the membership. So last year we placed a couple of interns. They spent, maybe 5 or 6 weeks with us, and then we put them over in Wells Fargo. We've had a couple people go from the chamber into Coca-Cola. Companies like that. So I'm a huge fan of internships generally. There's huge opportunities here. I strongly recommend it. The second thing, though, if you'll allow me, is I would like to put something else on the table for sort of young people to consider, and that's English teaching. And that's coming over to China. That's what I did when I came over. I came over with no job, nothing, knew nothing, and just sort of showed up in China. And I got a job at a local university doing what I know how to do, which is speak English. And it was a lot of fun. I got to know a lot of Chinese students, really had a lot of fun. I also want to point out that, so that was my career path. That was one of my first things that I did out of college, but not just mine. Catherine Tai, actually, she is now the U.S. trade representative. A remarkable woman. If you want to look her up on Wikipedia and sort of follow what she's done in her career, she was an English teacher when she came right out of college, and so that's worked out very well for her. So I want to sort of offer that up as sort of something that I view it as being somewhat similar or equivalent to an internship, because it's something that maybe people don't think about wanting to do as their career, but it's something to do to sort of gain experience and on the ground experience here in China. So I'll just offer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Kerr did a great job of kind of summing this up. And I too am a major supporter of internships. I think they offer a unique and very positive opportunity for students to really understand the China-US relationship on a deeper level, particularly engaging with economic exchange, which is sort of, I think Kerr said and agree with, is the main animator of US-China relations right now. The only thing that I would say that I always push my students towards is in internships is to make sure that they're not in an internship bubble. which I think is sometimes something that can occur. I believe very strongly, and I don't want to be too much of a stickler for this, but that language study is imperative. If you really want to begin to sort of understand China, if you plan a career in China, I don't think that means fluency or anything like that, but I feel very strongly that that it's critical to engage with some type of language study, and that could just be on your own. It could be, a more formal engagement, but I think internships offer a great deal of opportunity, but that the real completion of sort of engaging with China also requires some type of language engagement. And so that's what I always encourage students, if they're going to do an internship, to find ways, even if it's pushing themselves to go out and just chat on the street, to find ways to also engage with the language and language study.
I think I get a lot of common feelings from Mr. Gibbs and Dr. Scarlett, because you mentioned begin as an English teacher and also study Chinese, which are very important, of course. I recall that when I was in college, I had 2 English teachers. One is from Australia, the other is from America. We still have a contact these days. So it's really good for a start up, a period. And also study Chinese, although it's a difficult language, but time can solve everything. And I want to add a point, that is, if not for the sake of travel expenses, come to China to do in-person or on-site internship. Because I hosted several interns, and one is in my office, as I mentioned. I will take her to visit, some tourist sites, and during the travel, go there and back, we can communicate a lot on different topics, and I will took her to dinners, and we can meet new friends. This will give you a very splendid experience about China. And I had 3 interns doing remote internship. Oh, sorry, that's my clock. Sorry. And I had 3 interns who do remote internship. They all give me very impressive feedback, but it's just that the communications are not, it's kind of, scattered. It's not continue. It's like that's after 5 days of silence, we suddenly had a scheduled meeting to discuss my assignments and their feedback. It's kind of, scattered, and it's not a system thing that can help you really to benefit from the program. So my point is still be, come to China if you can, and I will be very warmly welcome. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And now we're going to transition to our question and answer part of this webinar. We appreciate everyone who has attended and has still here. I know we've gone a bit over time today, but we'd really like to have the audience be able to ask questions. We have one in the chat from Elizabeth Miller, who said, in response to Mr. Gibbs from AmCham, it seems English teaching in China has gotten significantly more difficult recently. Do any panelists think, given the release of new policies governing foreign teachers, showing up in China and hoping to find a teaching job is still a safe, effective way to start a career in China? And then she put a news article here to reference.
I guess that's for me to respond to first, but yes, I mean, it's certainly safe. I'm not sure what that's in reference to. I would though say that that everything has become more difficult in many different ways. One is everything has become much more competitive. Things, when I first came to China, it was a very different country, at a very different stage, and just the competition. I mean, there weren't a lot of foreigners like myself coming to China, and so it was fairly easy for me to find a job. And then kind of after college or business school and whatnot, and again, I was hired into the Boston Consulting Group to come to China, partly because of language skills and whatnot. I'm going to be very honest with you. I'm not sure that I would have that same opportunity today. I think it's much more competitive. There's more people that are interested in the China field. So I think you've got to bring more to the party. I think also, and I would extend that, in fact, to make a broader comment about China generally. And again, this is sort of, meant as criticism of some of the understanding in Washington, D.C. I think a lot of people in Washington, D.C. are so focused on the trade disputes and the idea that China is sort of, got unfair trade practices, unlevel playing field, all these different things. And they're sort of ignoring the fact that it's also true that China is just very competitive. And when I look at the American companies doing business here, they compete head to head with their domestic counterparts. And again, most of the American companies that are operating here, they're not upset about that. They're not sort of calling foul just because of competition. Competition is a good thing. It's fundamental to the way the American economy works, right? Competition is core to how we operate. Competition makes everybody better. But it's something that people should be aware of, that this is a very competitive environment over here. Everything moves super fast. Everybody knows that China is very large and complicated, but what a lot of people don't realize is how fast things move over here. So again, back to a point that I think that Professor Scarlett made, which is that there's no substitute for coming over here and feeling what's going on in China. And one of those feelings is just how fast things move. China has very much embraced the sort of Silicon Valley view of business and the sort of fail fast concept, and that's one of the sources of strength and sources of success around some of their technology companies. So I'll stop there.
I would just add to this question directly from Elizabeth Miller that I actually think the stipulation of these rules is a good thing. I think that there was a period, I graduated from university in the mid 2000s, and a lot of my friends actually went over to China to try to teach English. And most of them had very positive experiences, but there was the occasional experience of someone showing up and, supposedly going to teach at a school in Beijing, and then the school is actually 2 hours outside of Beijing, and a lot of confusion about that. And I actually think that things have gotten better, and that the sort of articulation of these requirements and rules that Elizabeth Miller is pointing to here is actually a good sign, because I think this means that English teaching is becoming more formalized and more standardized, and something that Americans can actually trust a little more, that the school they're going to show up to is sort of where it says it is, and is sort of a legitimate place too. So I actually am more optimistic about teaching English in China now, post-pandemic, than I was, say, 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, and I did want to ask, this is a question we get asked every day, is when will Americans, US citizens, be able to go back to China, to travel to China, to intern in China? As you guys mentioned, there are many students that are curious, that want to go, that are excited to go. And of course, we have the travel restrictions right now. So what would be your best guess or estimate as to when US students, faculty members, professors will be able to go back to China?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that one. We were talking a little bit before this the webinar started. I'm unfortunately not very optimistic. That is the number one issue right now that we have in the American business community, is mobility, business travel. And when is it good? We have a daily conversation with local authorities about that, when they're going to release it. It's a change. It's a moving target. So they're updating the policies often, having to do with COVID testing, visa restriction, and then quarantine. At this point, China is still theoretically allowing business people, so people with a business visa, to come back into China. So they are allowing that, but it's highly restricted, and they're not allowing even the dependents of business executives. And that part of it is closed. Now, again, that's a moving target. I would expect those policies to be revised. especially based on vaccinations and how many cases are still prevalent in some of these countries. So it'll be revised, but right now it's highly restricted, and so it's going to be difficult, I think, especially for young people. So keep an eye on it. I think it's reasonable to expect some changes, especially through the summer as COVID cases continue to drop and the vaccines come into place. But probably some kind of restriction can be expected really through the Beijing Olympics. So what we're talking about there is February of 2022, and so where there's going to be some level of restriction. So I think we are stuck for a while, unfortunately. I wish I had better news.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just, I think one thing we struggled with at our university, and I think is applicable to other universities, not just the visa issue, but then the issue of quarantining. And while visa restrictions might be lifted, I think it's particularly difficult to ask a group of college students, some of whom maybe have never been to China or never even left home, to then kind of arrive in a country and be isolated and quarantined. And we talked a lot about mental health, about sort of guiding them through those things. I think it's easier for the individual business traveler or someone who has a lot of China experience to maybe go and quarantine, but the idea of isolation, or even selling parents on the idea of, we're going to take your student to China and then they're going to have to be isolated for 2 or 3 weeks before they can actually start an internship, is a particularly difficult issue. So I think there's two things. We have to look at the visa issue, but then the quarantine issue before we can really feel confident that students can go to China.
Yeah, I completely agree. And one of the things we're working on with both governments is this idea of a vaccine passport and mutual recognition of vaccines. And I think if we can get some more progress around that, then that might be able to impact the quarantine. So instead of having a 14-day quarantine, which sometimes becomes a 21-day quarantine, into sort of maybe a 3+3 kind of quarantine situation where we can shorten the quarantine based on people's vaccination status. But so keep watching the space. It's a moving target. It changes daily, but that's the situation today.
Thank you so much. I don't know if anyone else had any other questions that they wanted to ask real quick before we end the session. I know we've gone a bit over today. I really appreciate all of your time with us. So we can also have people send us questions as well later if you didn't have a chance. We're happy to get those out, but you have my email here as well. So please let us know if you have any other questions. We had some before the session that we submitted, so you guys were able to cover that. But thank you again so much for your time today and your flexibility and just sharing your expertise with us. All three of you is greatly appreciated, and this means a lot to Absolute Internship and to our students and the universities we work with, and also our host companies. So thank you so much for your time today. We do have a question. Sorry, real quick before we finish. Sure. Heather, yes, tell us your question, please.
Hi. So first off, thank you for taking the time to discuss this with us today. It's really super interesting. So I did have a question, and I'm not sure if anyone can really comment, but in the last few years, there's been closures across the world in regards to like the Confucius Institutes. And I was wondering if you thought that was due to like maybe difference of opinion in regards to US relations with China, or do you think that's not related? And do you think that the closures may have any long-term effects on an interest in Chinese culture? And if you can't comment, it's totally okay.
Who wants to take it? I'm sort of pointing to Professor Scarlett being in the education sector, but I'll take it if you want. I reluctantly.
Well, I can simply say that the Confucius Institutes have been one of the targets of the American government, looking at it as sort of a arm of Beijing's soft power reach, which I think is a mistaken policy. And that has come home even in the President Biden's nominee for the UN ambassador, at her hearing was even questioned about a speech she gave many years ago at a Confucius Institute, which didn't even really was not anything controversial, but just the fact that she had given this speech at a Confucius Institute suddenly became a major issue at her hearing. I see that as a cudgel, though, that American politicians are using to sort of look like they are taking a tough stance against China. I don't see the Confucius Institutes as an insidious force that Beijing is using. And with that being said, though, I think that their peak, which was in the early 2010s, has sort of passed, and that I think we'll see more and more of them close across the country, unfortunately. And the other unfortunate part of that is that often provokes a backlash in China, where then the Chinese government uses as an excuse to close more American organizations in China, and we're sort of in this downward cycle that needs to be arrested. Mr. Gibbs, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add a little bit to that. I mean, I am pro-education, pro-exchange, pro-people to people, and all of that kind of stuff. And I would say, the more people are studying in various different environments, the better. Having said that, I do think that China would be again. I don't think we can change China the way China is in China. I do think that we need to be very careful about how we interact with China and make sure that China's values don't collide with our values. We have a very different society. And what I mean by that in this context is academic freedom on our campuses. So again, I don't have personal experience with the Confucius Institute, so I'm not going to comment specifically on that. But we have seen cases where academic freedom on American campuses has been impacted in the sense that, Chinese students, show up on the campus and say, oh, you can't have this speaker, you can't have that speaker, or these other students aren't allowed to think this way or aren't allowed to ask these kinds of questions, and that's not okay. I think we as Americans need to guard our academic institutions, because that's a key part of our strength. Is our academic institutions and all of the values that they represent. I would also point out again, because I don't have personal experience with the Confucius Institute, so it's not fair for me to comment on them. I would comment, though, that, and this is back to one of the things that the Trump administration, as critical as I am of a lot of ways that they approach things, they were correct in pointing out the lack of reciprocity. So in other words, I mean, I don't want to make a joke out of this, but how many American Confucius Institutes are there in China, right? I mean, China is a highly restricted society. It's highly regulated. You cannot have American diplomats are not allowed to just walk onto a Chinese campus and start talking to students. They can't. That's a violation of Chinese law. There's a lot of violations that so China protects their own campuses very. Now, again, that's not to justify closing this one. We got into this debate, deep into this debate over this whole Wechat ban, where America wanted to ban Wechat in the U.S. And we were very quick to point out that that's a mistake. It was wrong for the Trump administration to even try to do that. But we were also quick to point out that who started this? Right? I mean, Twitter has been blocked in China since the beginning. And looking at TikTok, TikTok was also blocked, which again, we think that's a mistake. But gosh, they've got 100 million users in America. Well, wait a minute. How many American tech giants could have 100 million registered users in China? Zero, right? So there's a real lack of reciprocity there. So, but again, how do we want to solve that problem? I'd rather see both sides opening up and bring down the Great Firewall and have one internet and more global access to information. I'd rather solve the problem that way rather than have the United States copy the, frankly, bad practices of the other side, if that makes sense. So anyway, just a thought.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I would like to add something about the Confucius Institute. There are disputes in China about why we spend so much money every year to support the Confucius Institute worldwide. It's a lot of money. People say we can use that money to lift more poverty in China. We can use that to finance the people, the students from poor areas, rural areas, kind of stuff. Anyway, but to me, it's like Confucius Institute is primarily a tool to help people to study Chinese language. That's the primary purpose. But gradually, people will give it different purposes, like to pass the Chinese culture to other places. That's not what I want it to be. As a civilian, I just want. I'm a taxpayer. I pay a lot of tax every year, and I want my money to be spent on help foreigners to study Chinese language so that they feel more confident to do business with China, to come to China. If you speak Chinese, it will be more comfortable to China, of course. That's a very simple logic. So I hope the Confucius Institute can continue, but start to a transition to focus on teaching Chinese. That's all. So simple. Thanks.
Thank you again so much, all of you, for your time today. We'll go ahead and end this session. It will be recorded for all the people who aren't able to attend live today. So thank you again so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and honor having all three of you here. And we hope you have a good rest of your day, evening, and speak to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay. Good
Yeah,
night,
thank
everybody.
you so much for the perfect.
Thank you, everybody.